So, where do our political beliefs really come from? We all like to think they're the result of some careful, deliberate thought, a totally rational choice we make about the world. But what if there's way more to it? What if deep seated, even biological forces are shaping how we see the whole political landscape? In this explainer, we're going to look under the hood at the neuroscience of politics, and, well, what we find might just change how you see your own beliefs and maybe even the beliefs of the people you disagree with.
This quote, it really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? We assume our political identity is this logical conclusion we've reached. But a whole lot of science is starting to suggest that forces happening just below our conscious awareness, everything from ancient social instincts to the actual wiring of our brain, are constantly shaping who we are as political animals. And this isn't just some theory, it has very, very real consequences.
And just look at this data. For decades, you can see our feelings toward the opposing party have been just plummeting. But that bottom chart, that reveals something even more startling. Around 2012, our dislike of the other side officially became a stronger political motivator than our love for our own side. This is the kind of polarization we need to understand, but on a neurological level.
Okay, so if it's not all about rational choice, what's really driving our decisions? Well, the first piece of the puzzle is in our highly evolved social brain, which seems to treat politics less like a spreadsheet and more like a playground.
Researchers have this great name for it, playground cognition. Because when you really think about it, politics, with all its spats, its alliances, the name calling, it kind of resembles a giant schoolyard, right? Scientifically, this is all about our innate ability to read social cues. We're constantly assessing candidates not just on their policies, but on their character, their intent. You know the classic who would you rather have a beer with question? That's playground cognition in action. And those social signals can often outweigh everything else. As researchers Fowler and Schreiber put it, on this big political playground, we're constantly scanning our environment. We're figuring out who to team up with, who to stay away from, and exactly where we fit in the pecking order. This ancient social toolkit we all have is being applied directly to how we choose our leaders today. And here's the kicker. We have hard evidence for this. When researchers put partisans in brain scanners and had them think about politics, the active areas weren't just the cold, logical processing centers. No, instead, regions associated with social cognition totally lit up, the exact same parts of the brain we use to understand other people's intentions and feelings. It seems our brains literally treat politics like a social relationship. So this social aspect leads to a pretty powerful and, honestly, a kind of sobering conclusion. Our political identities don't just reflect our beliefs. They actively filter the information we accept as true, shaping our very perception of reality itself. This happens through a cognitive bias called motivated reasoning. And here's the wild part. We often use our intelligence not to form our political identity with logic, but to defend it once it's already established. Our politics feel like a core part of who we are, right? So our brain's reasoning skills subconsciously become this defense shield to protect that identity from any information that might threaten it. This leads to a very logical question, doesn't it? I mean, if the problem is just that people are misinformed, then shouldn't providing more facts, more scientific education on a topic like climate change bring everyone toward a consensus? You'd think so, right? Well, the data reveals something completely counterintuitive and frankly stunning. In a study by Dan Kahan, it turns out that as conservative Republican scientific intelligence increased, their belief in human-caused global warming actually went down. Let that sink in. The most scientifically literate people in that group were the most skeptical, most likely because they were better equipped to argue against information that challenged their group's identity. More facts didn't bridge the divide, it actually made it wider. And this isn't just a one-off thing. We see the exact same pattern on other issues that tie into our identity. For highly religious people, for instance, greater scientific intelligence doesn't make them more likely to accept evolution. It seems our intelligence can become a weapon we use for identity defense, rather than a tool for objective discovery. So this all begs a deeper question. I mean, is this just a high-level cognitive trick we play on ourselves, or does this partisan divide go down to a much more fundamental level of our neurology? This brings us to some truly mind-bending research on what's called neural synchrony. It turns out that when people with the same ideology watch political content, their brains don't just reach similar conclusions. Their brain waves literally start to fire in sync, almost as if they're sharing one mind. So here's how one of these key experiments worked. Researchers put self-identified liberals and conservatives into fMRI scanners and had them watch 3 different videos. First, a neutral nature clip to get a baseline, then a standard news report, and finally, a really inflammatory political debate. They basically wanted to see what would happen inside their brains when the political temperature got turned way up. The findings were just incredible. During that heated debate, the brain activity of people with the same politics synced up dramatically. But at the exact same time, the brain patterns of liberals and conservatives completely diverged. It was as if they were experiencing two totally different neurological realities while watching the exact same video. And get this effect was even stronger for people who are psychologically uncomfortable with uncertainty. People who prefer a simple, predictable world. Their brains worked even harder to align with their group. And it gets even more fundamental. One recent study found something I can barely wrap my head around. They could predict a person's partisanship just by looking at how their basic sensory cortices responded to stimuli. We're talking about the parts of the brain that handle raw sight and sound. This suggests that our political identity might shape how we literally see and hear the world from the very first instant. This all leads us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? If these differences are wired this deeply into our brains, could they have a biological origin? I mean, are our political leanings, at least in part, hardwired right into our genes? Well, the answer, which comes from these massive studies on identical and fraternal twins, is pretty shocking. Researchers have found that about 40% of the variation in our political attitudes can be attributed to genetic factors. Now, that doesn't mean there's a Democrat gene or a Republican gene, of course, but it does suggest a powerful biological predisposition towards certain worldviews. So what exactly is being passed down? Well, it seems to be these core psychological traits, things like a predisposition toward authoritarianism, or another trait called social dominance orientation, which is basically how much a person believes society should be structured as a hierarchy. And what's really fascinating is that the genetic basis for these political attitudes seems to be distinct from the genes that shape our general personality, which suggests there's a unique biological pathway just for politics itself. Now, it is absolutely critical to understand that genes are not destiny. They're more like a blueprint. So while a predisposition for a trait like authoritarianism might be there, the environment is hugely important in determining whether that switch actually gets flipped. Social conditions, perceived threats, these things can activate those impulses. And importantly, this isn't exclusive to any one political group. It can pop up anywhere on the spectrum when the conditions are right. So this leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. If our political divisions are rooted this deep in our social wiring, our cognitive biases, our synchronized brains, and even in our genes, can we ever truly bridge the divide? The science doesn't offer an easy fix. But what it does suggest is that the first step isn't about winning an argument. It's about understanding the hidden forces at play, not just in other people, but most importantly, in ourselves.